Hi, everybody. Today is Wednesday, March 26, 2025, and our friends Ray McGovern and John Helmer are back. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Let's get started, Ray, with what Mike Waltz said about the situation. The somehow is getting critical between the United States and Iran. Here is what he said, Ray.
And it is time for Iran to walk away completely from its desire to have a nuclear weapon. And they will not and cannot be allowed to have a nuclear weapons program.
That's enrichment, to the
that is weaponization, and that it's strategic missile program. Can you only imagine? We've seen the death and destruction that they're doing through its proxies between Hezbollah, the Assad regime, the Houthis, and what have you. If they had nuclear weapons, the entire Middle East would explode in an arms race. That is completely unacceptable to our national security. I won't get into what the back and forth has been, but Iran is in the worst place it has been from its own national security since 1979. Thanks to Hezbollah, Hamas, the Assad regime, and its own air defenses being taken out by the Israelis.
So there's still a chance for diplomacy. I know you don't want to get into
Of course. I mean, the president has all options on the table, but we want to be clear. This isn't some kind of tit for tat that we had under the Obama administration or Biden. This is the full program. Give it up or there'll be consequences.
I want to ask you closer to home what has been happening here with Tren de Aragua, TDA, we're going to call them, which have been designated by the Trump administration as terrorists. Last Saturday.
Yeah. Ray, let me go ahead and let me know your take.
Yeah, I was afraid, Nima, that Mike Waltz was a harbinger of a change in the judgment, the key judgment of the U.S. intelligence community made back in November of 2007, which said unanimously, all 16 intelligence agencies at the time, which said that Iran had stopped working on a nuclear weapon at the end of 2003 and had not resumed work on a nuclear weapon. This was big. 2003, of course, is when we, the US and the UK, went into Iraq on the false pretense that they were working on nuclear weapons. So this is big. Long story short, they got somebody honest do a national intelligence estimate on Iran, and that was the conclusion voiced with high confidence, November 2007. Every year since, to its credit, the intelligence community has reaffirmed that judgment. So here comes Mike Waltz on Sunday saying, well, wait a second, we are going to insist that Iran give up its nuclear weapons program. Well, he's pushing on an open door here. I mean, this is what the intelligence community assessment of yesterday, published yesterday, said. It's only 3 sentences. It deserves reading. Quote, we continue to assess Iran is not building a nuclear weapon and that Khamenei, the supreme leader, has not reauthorized the nuclear weapons program he suspended in 2003. There's a lot of pressure for him to do so, and there has been some public discussion of this, which was before taboo. And some nuclear weapons advocates, even within Iran, are trying to say, well, maybe we're going to change. But, quote, Khamenei remains the final decision maker over Iran's nuclear program, to include any decision to develop nuclear weapons. So all I'm saying here is that there's a whole lot of bluster, including by Mike Waltz and a lot of people in the administration here, to say, well, we have to end the Iranian nuclear program, when the intelligence community is remaining faithful to the truth and say there isn't any, okay? So if you're going to join Israel in attacking Iran, don't use that excuse that you used on Iraq, that they have a nuclear weapons program. We assess with high confidence unanimously that they don't. Now, that's a disincentive, it seems to me, for for our president to go ahead and join Israel in attack on Iran. I think it helps for Trump to know this, and that I'm an outlier on this because a lot of my colleagues say it's almost inevitable that we'll get involved in a war with Iran. I don't think so. I think when this transactional president gets the real scoop here, and this is encouraging, this is Tulsi Gabbard and the rest of them, I think he'll change his mind if he had any idea that he would get involved in a no-win war against Iran.
John.
Well, I have to concede to raise this analysis of what's happening in Washington. From a Russian point of view, I'm simply saying again, as we've said before, that the air defense of Iran against an outside attack by Israel and the United States or any other party is a Russian strategic interest, since and we've talked about it before, this isn't a Putin policy. It goes back to Stalin and goes back another 100 and more years. Russia will not tolerate Iran to become a platform again for launching attacks on Russian Caucasus and the south of Russia. I heard, and we both heard, Waltz saying that Iran's air defense has been destroyed. Well, perhaps he'll have to wait and be taught that A, that has not happened. There was, as I recall, one Israeli attack on 2 Iranian radar sites with, from what I saw in the photographs, if they were accurate, minimal damage. Now, if Waltz thinks anyone listening on the Russian side, on the Iranian side, agrees that Iranian air defenses have been destroyed, let him and the Israelis try it on. I'm surprised in one way that Waltz would make statements as inaccurate as that when basically issuing a warning of US-Israeli war against a state. It's a lie, or at the very least, if you don't consider it a lie, a serious understatement. If that's the understatement, President Trump and the others in the so-called Principles Committee that we've heard about over the last weekend, the committee that Jeffrey Goldberg intercepted, are about to understand reality. And from what we already know about that committee, its grip on reality is very weak. And the president's even worse.
Yeah, I would add a little quote from Ayn Rand, of all people, who famously said that it's possible to ignore reality, but it's not possible to ignore the consequences of ignoring reality. Okay. Now, what John says here, let them try to get through that. Not only did they do minimal damage to the Israelis, but also in the interim, the Russians have provided the Iranians with all manner of fairly sophisticated air defense systems, mostly missiles. Not only that, but other armaments as well. They have a treaty signed just a few days before Trump came into office again, a Russian-Iranian treaty. It's close to a defense treaty. It's not a mutual defense treaty, but there's lots of reason to believe precisely what John just said. The Russians are not going to be happy with what seems to be in the planning stage by the likes of Michael Waltz. And in these private discussions one-on-one, I can be sure, and you can be sure, that Putin is raising this with Trump and saying, look, you have a lot of crazy still in your administration. Don't even think of getting into a war for Israel against Iran.
John, you mentioned this situation with the Trump administration, that they were talking on Signal, and there were some leaks, and the editor of Atlantic was on that forum. How did you find the whole situation, the way that they were talking to each other? You said that they are not that much informed. What's your evaluation of that?
Look, I see this from Russian point of view, but also from the point of view of a long time ago working on White House decision-making papers. It's profoundly important to be understood, but it's not a case, not simply a case, as has been pushed in the Western press, in the US press, in the Democratic Party press, of incompetence, mistakes of that kind. No. It shows something far, far more serious, and therefore one could have to believe that if what we saw, what the evidence is of the Principals Committee on Yemen over the weekend, if that's the way they make decisions, almost anything's possible. Let me just try and go through it for you a bit. On the one hand, the missing person in that chat, the missing presence, is President himself. The president is missing, and the only evidence, as I've tried to search through the records, that President Trump made a decision to attack the Houthis, and it's a decapitation attack. It was an attempt to kill the leadership of Ansar Allah in the same way that the Israelis had killed the leadership of Hezbollah and the leadership of Hamas, as they continued to do so. In the first place, all I could find, and Ray may correct me if he's found something else, that President Trump didn't sign a paper. President Trump didn't look at the options. And exactly as Ray just quoted Ayn Rand as having said, there's no discussion of the consequences of even the success of the raid they were contemplating, never mind the consequences of failure. Now, my understanding of the way a White House, of a presidency of the United States, a serious country, makes decisions is on an options paper in which several options are at the bottom of a paper after first risk and target and US objective are identified. Second, different methods, options for achieving that objective are identified. And then third, the consequences of success, the consequences of failure are identified. And at the bottom, in a set of boxes, option 1, option 2, option 3. And if the president's feeling irritable or tired, he simply puts a tick in one box or another. Now, adapt that to a presidency that doesn't read quite the way President Carter used to read, reams of paper. What you've got is a statement by the Deputy Chief of Staff, Stephen Miller, that he had heard Trump say he agreed to the attack on Yemen and the Houthis. That's all I have been able to find. Otherwise, what you have is a discussion of, at 11:44, according to Goldberg, he heard the chat began. That was 2 hours only before the attack began on Yemen. 2 hours. That means a decision had already been made some time earlier. And the only reference I can find is that there had been a situation room briefing prior to the conversation in which Stephen Miller, a deputy assistant in the White House, heard Trump say something to approve the raid. Even if that was true, there's no discussion of what the consequences of success would be, the consequences of failure. Now, to have no substance of objectives and consequences discussed is the most serious indictment of this new administration's procedure for deciding between peace and war. I can't imagine anything graver. I can't imagine anything, in my experience, and Ray's is more detailed, in US presidential decision-making history, of something as empty as that. Now, when the press focuses on whether Vice President Vance was insulting to the Europeans, who was present, we know that Vance, Rubio, Waltz, Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, Hegseth, the Defense Secretary, and Susan Wiles, the Chief of Staff, was present, completely silent but nobody can be closer directly and personally to Trump than her own chief of staff. Pardon me. If she didn't say in the text, and Goldberg didn't hear us say, the president didn't say that, or the president thinks that the consequences on the negative side might outweigh the benefits on the positive side. If she was silent, then how can this administration decide seriously between peace and war? It astonishes me that all Goldberg purports to have heard, the so-called classified materials, are targets on the ground, types of munitions, and the timing. But we know that timing was already decided by somebody else. How was the timing decided before that chat? All of the attacks by the Democratic Party-oriented press failed to notice. So many serious things are missing that go to the question not of the credibility of the staff people, but the credibility of a president who makes decisions on the basis that he doesn't pay attention to the consequences. Now, if I were them, I would classify that as top secret, no foreign eyes. The most serious classification you can hit with a president on a presidential decision-making process, because it reveals something more serious that, from a Russian point of view, indicates that Trump is capable of almost anything based on almost anything false that he's given by his national security advisor, his secretary of defense, his secretary of state. And in that context, the intelligence community represented by Tulsi Gabbard made no effort whatever in that record to say, Mr. President or Mr. Secretary or Mr. National Security Advisor, the intelligence community findings are that what you are planning to do is a profound mistake. I mean, I accept that Ray's confidence in Tulsi Gabbard was based until now on her capacity to represent the intelligence community consensus, but she didn't then. Why do we therefore conclude that the Houthis, that the assassination of Ansar Allah, which apparently didn't happen, is so small of consequence that the intelligence community consensus wasn't worth reporting? Or do we also think that they are so determined to go to war against Iran, they wanted to practice shooting practice with the Houthis first? Either way, what we saw isn't a case of incompetence. It's far, far worse. And there's one other participant people haven't focused on. Stephen Witkoff, the president's Middle East envoy, was in Moscow when he was on that Signal chat.
That's right.
Now, I've used Signal to talk with Russian sources. All of us agreed Signal has higher level of security, let's say, than Skype or Zoom, or even my simplest secure-proof dumb phone, as distinct from a smartphone. Nobody I've ever dealt with on Signal in Moscow believes that Signal is protected from Russian interception. If Russian, and you can be sure Witkoff would have been under the most intense security blanket that you can imagine, technologically speaking. So the Russians heard this. It's near certainty that they are not quite as incompetent at overhearing as these people were at hearing. Therefore, what we have, and I don't know why the Democrats in their attacks on what happened failed to notice, but it doesn't matter. This isn't partisan. This isn't party politics. This goes to the most serious question of how the United States government is currently acting. And I would have to say that reality or realism was presented in such a way that, as Ray said, the reality of consequences seems not to have been acknowledged. Now, that's the message I get from the Principals Committee on the Houthis that Goldberg inadvertently picked up.
Ray, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say that this must be very puzzling and very instructive to the Russians. First, let me hazard a guess as to why Signal was chosen. It wasn't to protect the conversation from Russian authorities. It was to protect the conversation from American authorities. They go on an American system, it's recorded. There's a record of it. So Signal, they thought was maybe secure. Naively, NSA could have told them that what was different, but so they wanted to keep this off any government record. You could just, the Signal thing can evaporate very quickly. Now, with respect to the substance, Trump is idiosyncratic, okay? He makes decisions, if not all by himself, at least with very chosen counselors like other real estate developers. Now this is bizarre, and the Russians look at this, and I too look at things from the Russian perspective. They look at this and say, "My God, this is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde," which you picked up on last time, John. Dr. Jekyll? Yeah, he's made a decision that there will be peace in Ukraine, and he's willing to twist those Ukrainians in such a way as to deal with us Russians and make it happen in the next couple of months. That's good. That's good for both of us. The fact that he does that without reference to options and all that kind of thing, well, he decided he was going to do it, he's going to do it. So idiosyncratic, yeah. Disturbing, yeah, because, the last thing they want is somebody who's unpredictable. But on this one, there's a measure of trust built up. I never thought I would be saying trust just a couple of months into Trump's second administration, but it's not me. It's President Putin's spokesperson, Peskov, who has talked about real trust between the two presidents. So that's good. Now, how about Mr. Hyde? My God, on the Middle East, it's awful. I mean, the administration policy is one of a psychopath, a sociopath, actually. Kill all the people. It doesn't really matter. Kill off a whole tribe of people or a whole people like Palestinians. That doesn't matter. We do that because Bibi wants us to do it. So that's also sort of idiosyncratic because there has to be. Well, I correct myself. There isn't any sensible voices in the administration with respect to Israel, Palestine. I thought, as John mentioned, that Tulsi Gabbard, she might be a little bit more sensible than the rest of us. It's sort of damning with being praised, But no, she turned around on Yemen specifically. So no. What I said about Yemen before, no. What I objected to before was under a different administration. It was the Democrats that were killing all the children and starving hundreds of thousands of them. Now it's okay. Hello, Tulsi. And just getting back to Gabbard and the whole national intelligence establishment, that's why I was so gratified. One can say this is not new. This is the American intelligence judgment about Iran not working on a nuclear weapon since 2007. Yeah, that's right. Here she is saying it in her prepared testimony of 15 minutes. And then I read those paragraphs. Nothing could be clearer. We reaffirm what we said that they stopped in 2003. And we know that Khamenei, the supreme leader, is the guy who decides. And we know that he has decided against it. So what I'm saying here is it's a mixed bag. And especially with respect to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But as far as the Russians are concerned, they look at this stuff and say, well, maybe it's not such a bad thing. Let's watch him a little bit longer and see if he can still proceed without having to consult all these people down the road because these people are not going to give him the straight story anyway. His instincts are our instincts. Let's proceed on a matter of trust that we have not been able to accord an American leader for, well, since 2013, when Obama and Putin worked out that deal on Syrian chemical weapons. There was trust then, and Putin said so in an op-ed in the New York Times. But it's a long time. Was that 12 years? Yeah, 12 years. So they're rebuilding it now. That's the good news. And this telephone call, it is very instructive, but it doesn't tell the Russians anything that they don't already know. It does mean that maybe J.D. Vance is a little bit more sensible than the rest of us. And I think one could take as a given that the president made it very clear what he wants to happen. And that's why you have Mike Waltz saying those things as he did on Sunday.
Can I just agree and qualify, pardon me, what Ray said? I accept the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde characterization of Trump. But if I remember the story, and it's been rather a long time since I read Robert Louis Stevenson, there comes a time when the control between Jekyll and Hyde breaks down. And Hyde no longer is in control of his monster. And Jekyll threatens Hyde. Have I got the story wrong? I read it as a small boy a long time ago. But basically, from a Russian point of view, what I think is happening here, what is learned from the intercepted signal conversation, is there comes a point when a sociopathic, psychopathic decision-making process cannot be stopped by Mr. Hyde, because Dr. Jekyll has taken over. And at that point, force rules, not diplomacy, not negotiation, not trust. And if force rules only against targets you think you can bomb to smithereens, and the consensus of that conversation was the United States and Israel can do that to Iran, the Russian conclusion would be that there's no possibility of a stable agreement with President Trump, except for the outcome on the battlefield. Dr. Jekyll is out of control. Mr. Hyde doesn't exist anymore.
Let me play a clip of Lavrov talking about the nature of the relationship between Russia on one part and China, Iran, and North Korea on the other part.
Of a comprehensive partnership and a strategic interaction with China are very productive. Our strategic relations with India is developing, and the deepening of friendly ties with countries such as Islamic Republic of Iran and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea are flourishing.
Yeah. They're flourishing, and right now, when it comes to the way that Donald Trump has attacked Houthis, do you think that they wanted to intimidate Iran? That's why they attacked Houthis? Is that part of the plan that Netanyahu, I don't know, for whatever reason he wants to distract the tension, distract people from what's going on in Gaza and bring everybody's just changing everybody's mind to the situation between the United States and Yemen, and maybe a direct war between Iran and the United States. What do you make of this and the way that Russia is picturing the nature of the relationship between the countries that he mentioned, Lavrov mentioned?
Well, I would say this. I would say that sometimes things are less complicated than they seem at first. There's such a thing as inertia, okay? And so let's talk about the Houthis. They're very idiosyncratic themselves. When they're asked, why are you doing this? What's in it for you? You're going to get blasted to hell. They say, well, don't you understand as a matter of principle? I mean, when that first phase of the ceasefire there went into effect, the Israelis promised to stop the starvation of people in Gaza, but they never delivered. And yet we held off any attacks on Red Sea shipping until phase one was over. And when they still didn't deliver, when they canceled the thing out, we said, okay, well, we'll give you 4 days. And then they started interdicting traffic again. So when the Houthis are asked, why'd you do that? Well, somebody's got to stand up for the Palestinians. And I guess it has to be us because it's a matter of principle. Whoa, that's a rare commodity in these days. Now, with respect to exactly what happened, I imagine, and I don't know, of course, but Trump says, what do you do when these damn Houthis? I mean, who are they? They barefoot. They're like those old Viet Cong, remember? You know, brown feet, brown feet, go through the jungle. What do we do? And the answer comes, of course, well, we can blast the hell out of them. We do what the Israelis do. We decapitate them, see? And we get somebody like that Green Beret guy, Mike Waltz, to advertise, we decapitated one, another one comes right up, okay? So it doesn't make any sense, except you want to appear to be doing something, and the Pentagon says, hey, we could do this, and the president, well, do it then. And then these guys who are the receipt of this order say, well, my God, is this a good idea? Or should we wait a month? Or this is going to be bad for our, so inertia is what I attribute this to. Now, there's another view, and Nima, you were starting to get into that, and that is that Trump is so beholden to the Israelis and to the lobby that he is using the Houthis. He is accusing, as he is vocally accusing the Houthis of being just a pawn of Iran, and that they're going to they know who's behind this, it's Iran, they're going to get them, just like Mike Waltz says. Well, that may happen. I don't know for sure. But if it happens, they're not going to be any longer on the pretext that Iran either has a nuclear weapon or is working on a nuclear weapon. That's big. That excuse cannot be used. It's kind of stale because it was used on Iraq erroneously. It can't be used again anytime soon because of what the annual threat assessment subscribed to by the intelligence community as a whole released yesterday says. So that's why I take some hope. And I'm sort of an outlier here. Many of my colleagues think there will be a war, that the U.S. will have to join in defense of Israel because there's going to be attack on Iran. I don't think so. I think there are many, many factors that militate against that. And I think that a transactional president can finally see the light and say, this is really not ideal. This would be putting Israel first. I'm still thinking maybe putting America first.
John, how did you find in these sort of leaks that they had on Signal? Is there anything referring to what is the main objective in Yemen?
Not really. Well, there's the general statement, freedom of navigation. Vance's strange remark that that's a European responsibility because it doesn't hurt the United States quite so much as it hurts Europe. In fact, it's a global strategic realignment of routes, costs, and so forth that has happened. And the attack on the Houthis, as discussed in the Signal conversation, seems to be a display that Hegseth, Waltz, and Rubio say they endorse of the American power, the presidential power, to enforce a solution that for US purposes, the US wants. Now, with respect to Iran and North Korea, I simply need to reiterate that the Russian concern is to have a nuclear capable enemy on its border. And a nuclear, for that reason, Russia has consistently sought to mitigate the Iranian calculation that it had to have nuclear weapons in order to defend itself against Israel, a nuclear power. It has the same calculation in the Russian Far East towards North Korea, with the possible deployment of US nuclear weapons in South Korea and in a newly militarized expansionist Japan. So the Russian position on nuclear warfighting is to drive the risk of nuclear warfighting as far from its own borders as possible. Now, President Putin will be in New Delhi within a matter of a few weeks. He will be visiting, it hasn't been announced in Russia yet, but it's clearly understood in Delhi that President Putin will be visiting and meeting with Prime Minister Modi and his military and intelligence and foreign ministry associates in a matter of 2 to 3 weeks. The Indians are very clear that war in and against Iran would have very, very, very serious implications for India. The sense that someone can seriously underestimate Iran is very clear in Moscow. When the attempt was made by Yevgeny Primakov, then a sort of foreign minister, head of intelligence, repeatedly urged Saddam Hussein not to go to war against Iran because he would ultimately lose. At that time, what we know before Saddam Hussein of Iraq went to war against Iran for what he thought were his purposes in solidifying his regime against the new Iranian regime. At that time, Saddam Hussein was persuaded, he was mistaken, he was deceived, that he had US support to go to war against Iran at that time. Now, the Russian advice is don't go to war against Iran and don't go to war against North Korea. And they've been consistent about this for both Russian strategic reasons and allied reasons. And India is an ally of Russia in the same way that China is an ally of Russia. The message is that if the US thinks it can reassert its influence over Iran as a platform to attack Russia, then and it will therefore assist Israel, the expansionist Israel, the Israel that now has not only committed genocide against Gaza and is in the process of squeezing the surviving Gazans into the south of Gaza and push them into boats to nowhere. If the Israel that has already taken a big chunk of Syrian territory up to the suburbs of Damascus, the Israel that's expanding against the last major well-armed enemy, Iran, that's capable of breaking through Israel's Iron Dome and all its other air defenses, Israel has the same objective strategically against Iran that the United States once had for Iran. And both of them run up against the long-running Russian view. It cannot tolerate, existentially cannot tolerate for the safety of southern and far eastern Russia, a nuclear-armed enemy in the south, meaning Iran, an Israeli, US-controlled Iran, or in Korea, against a US-armed, nuclear-armed, a Korean and Japanese combination. That's the situation. And what we have then is, sorry, there's somebody knocking on my door delivering some dry cleaning. We'll just try to forget that they'll knock on the door. In this situation, there is a US interest in capturing Iran and North Korea that's independent, allied with Israel, yes, but independently American. And Trump seems to have bought that idea, regrettably. And the level at which the discussion proceeded indicates these chaps think, sorry, ladies and gentlemen, think, Ms. Wiles, Ms. Gabbard think, along with their associates, that in this strategic context, Russia can be neutralized because Russia needs a US-mediated peace in the Ukraine. This is a fundamental mistake.
Ray, go ahead.
No, I'd just like to get back to how the Russians are looking at this now, and quote once again Peskov after the last one-on-one telephone conversation, saying that Putin and Trump, quote, trust each other. They intend to put relations between the two countries back on track. And what Peskov says is, look, there's a solid will, quote, a solid will on the part of both presidents to restore ties, and that the leaders, quote, understand each other very well, period, end quote. Well, I think that helps throw light on the urgency that both leaders feel in getting this thing in Iran, in Ukraine wrapped up. Now, you could understand Trump wanting to get this behind him. I mean, a lot depends on what else he wants to do, and he promised to do it. He thought he could do it in a day or so. He said, anyhow, he's doing it. But if I'm in the Kremlin, I'm asking my intelligence people, how long do you think Trump is going to be around? Well, you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to advise President Trump, President Putin, by saying, not very long. How long did John Kennedy hang around after he made clear that he wanted to make peace with us? Now, he has the deep state to contend with, which is even deeper and more powerful than what John Kennedy faced, and they did him in, okay? We have Senator Chuck Schumer saying on the 2nd of January 2017, before Trump was ever president the first time, oh, the intelligence community has 6 ways to Sunday to get back at you if you take them on. Well, Trump is taking them on. Today came the announcement that the FBI files showing what the FBI and the CIA and NSA and the rest of the intelligence community did to Trump during the first 4 years is going to be released unredacted. Whoa. Now, wow. So he's taken on the intelligence community? What about the military-industrial complex, which is part of the deep state? He's taking them on too. What's happened to stocks of the arms makers in our country? What's happened to the stocks of independent arms makers in Europe? Okay, why? Because Trump has said, we want a little peace in Ukraine, and we're going to take on the military-industrial complex as well. Actually, the widely held assumption that the Trump administration, like all its predecessors, is beholden to the military-industrial complex for delivering the votes of congressmen. Well, it's not so much active anymore. So what am I saying here? Well, if you're challenging, you're throwing down the gauntlet before the deep state, and you're sacrificing the interests of the military-industrial complex. Yeah, the arms that the Europeans want to make now most of them are not being by bought from Lockheed and Raytheon, but from their own indigenous capability. So what I'm saying here is that if I were advising Putin, I would say, we don't know how long Trump's going to be around. If past is precedent, not very long. So let's get this thing done. There is some incentive for you, Mr. Putin, to be flexible. You've won the war, but you don't have to rub it in. Give him something that can make it appear that you made some concessions to him, but get the thing done before something very bad happens to President Trump, and God knows what will happen after that. We didn't have a very good experience with LBJ after JFK was killed. So do it now, Mr. Putin. And I see that as one factor accounting for the haste with which the Russians are moving, whereas they don't have to, for God's sake. They can just attrit all the way up to Western Ukraine and certainly the Dnieper River. Just an observation, but I think it's one that not only we should keep in mind, but that surely Putin is being reminded of, and it's an incentive for him to move forward quickly before Trump leaves the scene by whatever means.
John, your take.
Well, Ray and I agree on what we hope is the interaction or combination between Trump's calculation, Putin's calculation in each other, and Putin's calculation in the Russian interest, Trump's calculation in his own interest. I've watched several times Mr. Witkoff's extraordinary interview with Tucker Carlson. Very rarely have I seen such a display of brown noses on either side of the table for a whole hour. It's very difficult to watch people brown-nosing each other, as Carlson did to Witkoff and Witkoff did to Carlson, but there you are. What Witkoff did was to reveal that Putin offered as a gift to President Trump a portrait, to be sure, Witkoff said, by the leading Russian artist, as if Russia has only one artist in the country to paint a portrait of President Trump. Now, as I understand it, President Trump has a fixation on his image and has objected to the state of Colorado and the governor of Colorado placing a portrait on the walls of the State House in Colorado, which Trump doesn't like. We've yet to see what the portrait of Trump the Russians have produced is like, and whether it suits Trump's need for a self-reflection that he likes.
Well, it's got a halo around it, John. The halo.
Quite possibly. Not to mention wings. The point is I'm trying to make is that President Putin very well understands Trump's character in a way that is not reciprocated on the other side, but that is neither here nor there. Second, there's no doubt that the Russian side concludes, let's get the best deal out of the US at this moment of opportunity, as long as we can, and let's prolong the president's sense of the moment of opportunity for whatever other calculations he may be making. I agree entirely. But then let's look at exactly what is being agreed to, what the joint statements that were issued out of Jeddah after the US meetings with the Ukraine and the US meetings with the Russian side. And then you'll see that the Russians are going exactly as Ray said, as fast as they can along the line of contact moving west. They are establishing as best they can a demilitarized zone in Sumy region to prevent what was in the last few days an attempt at breaking out and a new Ukrainian attempt to attack Belgorod region, just as the Kursk region invasion is being encircled and is close to being destroyed entirely. We've seen massive Russian attacks now in and around the port of Odessa. What do these things mean? On the ground, Russia is moving systematically as fast as it can to advance westward to destroy the Ukrainian capacity to fight and to reach a capitulation of the Ukrainian army. At the same time, the concessions required to make Trump think, make the world think, that Russia is agreeing to eventually the ceasefire that would lead to a settlement. On the one hand, the agreement to a ceasefire against energy infrastructure, which is still in principle, has not been implemented. It's been violated by the Ukrainian side with the assistance of the United States since the telephone call from President Putin and Mr. Trump. But we now see the readiness of the Russian side to agree, and this is in the joint statement released by the US side. Nothing's been released by the Russian side. The readiness of the Russian side to conclude terms of ceasefire in the Black Sea, which would involve the restoration of the Black Sea Food and Grain Initiative, which the Russians left because the last terms of the last form of that initiative had been violated by the other side. In particular, the refusal to allow Russian exports of fertilizer through the Black Sea. Yeah. Go ahead, Ray.
I wanted to say, John, I know that you've been traveling all around the world, but the Russians have come out with a statement, the same as the U.S. statement now. It apparently was delayed by 8 hours because of presumably bickering with the Ukrainians themselves. Yes. But the Russians have come to an agreement. And the last paragraph of the agreement, it talked about a ban on attacks on energy infrastructure starting, mind you, on March 18th. No, March 18th was their conversation, of course. It's already been violated, but they're backdating it to March 18th, sort of giving Ukraine one last chance to abide by it, and the Russians as well. So on April 18th, we're going to know whether at least that incremental step has been met. The other thing is the grain deal is comprehensive, and it satisfies a lot of Russian demands, given the fact that that earlier one was not enforced because they relied on the UN and the Turks to try to enforce it. So there's going to be monitoring of those merchant vessels going in and out to watch for arms supplies and so forth. All of the things that the Russians wanted in that first one, they're saying we insist on in the second one. The big deal is the U.S. agreed. And what happened in Saudi Arabia, apparently, was they said to the very high-level Ukrainian delegation, Umerov, the defense minister, led it. So you wait in the cafeteria, and we'll come tell you what's going on. And bilateral U.S.-Russian talks, and then a U.S. guy would come in and say, okay, here's what we decided. Go tell Zelensky. Okay, here's what we decided. Go tell Zelensky. And apparently Zelensky said, I don't want to do that for 8 hours until they said, look, tell Zelensky, time's up. And that's when they released pretty much identical statements, issuing or sort of explicating what was agreed on. And I was amazed. I mean, it really is going very, very fast. And I think the reasons are clear. They want this thing behind them. And I see great hope in that. That's the good part of the Jekyll Hyde sort of thing.
Well, let me put the bad part. let me read out the sentence that the U.S. side and the Russian side agreed to on the Black Sea. They're going fast, all right, but they're going fast backwards in time. Listen to the language. The U.S. will help restore Russian access to markets for agricultural products and fertilizer, reduce insurance costs, enhance ports and payment systems for, and I can't read my own writing, for such transactions. These are the terms that Russia, the UN, the Turkey mediation, and the Ukraine agreed to several years back, and you go back to the Dances with Bez, where we investigated the ways in which that was violated, especially on fertilizer and payment systems for agricultural transactions.
Right.
So we're going back to that agreement, which the Ukrainians, with the assistance of the Biden administration, with the encouragement of the Biden administration, violated. So it's definitely a positive, I agree with Ray, that we are back where we were before the Biden administration intervened to block the Black Sea Initiative, with the assistance of Secretary General of the of the UN, Mr. Guterres, who is not considered a neutral mediator and will never be used in such a way by the Russians ever again. So it's hopeful that we're going back to that and taking what was agreed before forward. However, the language is the US will help. And the language of the US-Ukrainian joint statement again adopts Ukrainian positions. Regrettably, as I read it, in almost entire Western press, including the US press, nobody has asked Peake and Anton, the two lead US negotiators. They don't even seem to have identified that Peake and Anton were the lead negotiators at all. Russia identified the lead negotiators, Karazin and Beseda, a long time ago. The Ukrainians, as Ray said, sent an even higher ranking Ukrainian delegation and then dominated the Western press readout interpretation since. One could say, yes, I agree with Ray, there's hopeful movement towards the restoration of the Black Sea as an area of ceasefire. But that would also have to include something that isn't there. That is to say, the US and the British and the French have to stop using the airspace above this new peace zone on the Black Sea for electronic warfare against Russia. There's no reason militarily for the US naval and US Air Force drones and fixed-wing aircraft to operate collecting battlefield intelligence over the Black Sea, supported by the British and supported by the French, if there's a ceasefire over the Black Sea. Now, I don't know whether the Russian expert side, Karazin, a senator and former deputy foreign minister, and General Beseda raised the issue of ceasefire on the Black Sea. And let's also be clear, who is the major military force fighting on the Black Sea in recent months? That's the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have been attempting to attack Russian gas pipelines to Turkey. Most of the, let's call it, war fighting on the Black Sea has been Ukrainian in character. Second, the provision that in the joint statement that commercial vessels will no longer be used for military purposes refers to the way in which the Ukrainians, with British help, with US targeting, have been using commercial vessels, let's say grain carriers, to carry naval drones, surface drones, and submarine drones southward in order to attack the Russian-Turkish gas pipelines. So is the United States willing, seriously, to stop that practice? If they are, is the United States seriously going to stop the use of the airspace above for that exact form of war fighting? Yeah. That's not in the paper.
Well, John, I think we need to proceed incrementally. Call it a trit, if you will. I think that's coming. What has already come, and something not mentioned yet, is sanctions. For this agreement to be implemented, sanctions on fertilizer, on fish, on agricultural projects, on John Deere tractors, are going to have to disappear.
Yes, and now, SWIFT too. The SWIFT has to be lifted for the agricultural bank. The state, the beginning of lifting, so the payment systems can work at least in that sector. That's a major breakthrough. Yes, I agree.
So some people some people are saying, aren't they clever, these Russians? They're trying to chip away at the sanctions, you know? Well, yeah, of course they are.
Right.
But it's in the agreement. It's going to be necessary. These things will take time. I think in another month we will see indications that we have told the British and the French, for God's sake, keep your aircraft out of the Black Sea for a while, would you please? And I think they'll do it. So I think that the big picture speaks of hope on Ukraine. It speaks of embarrassing disaster for the people of Gaza. And I don't think we can ever mention hope without speaking about our connivance, our enabling, our arming and fueling and paying for the extermination of a whole people in Gaza.
Thank you so much, Ray and John, for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
Most welcome, Nima. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Ray, and thank you, Nima.